Welcome everyone, my name is Scott and welcome back to this tutorial series on building a space shooter game with Phaser 3. Previously, we added a new spawn component for when our enemies are destroyed so we can play some explosion animations. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Alright, so now we wrapped up our section on our enemy spawners. What we're going to do next, we're going to start our UI and our audio section. And so in this section, we're going to go ahead and implement a scoring mechanic. So when our enemies are destroyed, we'll receive some type of score, and we're going to display that in our UI. We're going to implement player lives, so then that way we have multiple lives, and as our ship is destroyed, you can respawn. Then we're going to add in support for audio, and then finally we're going to enhance our game with some backgrounds to our canvas element. And so to get started, we're going to go ahead and knock out our backgrounds real quick. So what we're going to do is let's jump over to our game scene. And so in our assets folder, we have some very nice background sprite sheets here that we're going to go ahead and apply in multiple layers to get a very nice looking background. So what we're going to do is at the top of our create method, we'll go ahead and create these three game objects. And so for our background, we're just going to go ahead and use sprites. We're going to do this, we're going to add, and then we'll do sprite. And so for our sprite, we want to position these in the top left-hand corner. For our asset key, it's going to be BG1, 2, and 3. And then each of these, we're going to use frame 0. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and update our origin. And so for our X, we'll go ahead and do 0. So then that way it's on the left. And then for our Y value, we're going to have it at 1. So then that way it's all the way at the bottom. Next, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and update our alpha. And so we'll do set alpha. We're going to do 0.7. And so this is just going to make the images a little bit transparent. And then that way they can show through each other. And we'll be able to see each image. Next, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and rotate them. So we're going to go ahead and do set angle. And we're going to go ahead and do 90 for 90 degrees. And so the reason we're rotating our game objects is our sprite sheets that we're using, they are long images, and so they're meant to be displayed when our game width is greater than our height. But we actually have our properties reversed, so our game is higher than our width. And so by rotating these, we'll get a very nice effect. Finally, we're going to go ahead and set scale, and we're just going to go ahead and scale these up by a little bit for our Y values. We're going to do 1.25. So now if we go ahead and save, we should see our first image appear on our scene, and so we have like this purple looking smoke. So then what we're going to go ahead and do is I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go ahead and paste it a few times, and then we're just going to go ahead and add BG2 and then BG3, so then they're layered on top of each other. All right, and so these are animated. So what we're going to go ahead and do is then for each of these, we're going to go ahead and play an animation. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to do play, and then for our animation name, it's going to go ahead and be the same as our texture. And so we'll do play BG1. Let's copy that. I'm going to go ahead and paste it a few times, and let's do 2 and 3. Now when we save, we should get this really cool animated background, and we'll see everything's moving. Alright, so the next thing we're going to work on is we're going to add support for a score mechanic into our game. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple UI component that's going to listen for when our destroyed event is emitted. And when that happens, we're going to check which enemy was destroyed and update our score. And so for this to work, what we need to do is for each of our enemies, we need to actually give them a score value for how much their points they're worth when they're destroyed. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is in our config, let's go ahead and start with our enemy fighter. I'm going to copy this line here. And so instead of health, we're just going to say score, and we're going to say they're worth 200 points. Then we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for our scout. And so we'll have enemy scout score, and we're going to say 100 points since they don't fire back at us. And then what we'll do next is now we need to add in our phaser game text object to go ahead and display our score and to keep track of it. And so what we'll do is we're going to make a new class to keep track of all this. So what we'll do is under our objects, let's make a new folder. We're going to call this UI. And then what we'll do is let's make a new file. We're going to call this score.js. And so what we'll do is export our class score. And for this, we're going to go ahead and extend our phaser game object, our text game object. So then that way we can just use that to keep track of this. And so let's go ahead and do extends. We're going to do our phaser, our game objects, and then we'll go ahead and do text. So now for our text game object, we'll need our constructor. And so for us to add this to our scene, we'll need our phaser 3 scene. And then for us to go ahead and listen for when an enemy is destroyed, we're going to need that event bus component. And now because we're extending our text game object, we're going to go ahead and use super. And then for our scene, we'll pass in our scene. For our position, we're going to go ahead and position it in our top of our game in the center. So we'll go ahead and use our scale manager to go ahead and grab our width. And we're going to go ahead and divide it by 2 to center it. We're going to do 20 pixels down from the top. And then for our text, we'll go ahead and just start with the 0. And now what we'll do is let's go ahead and add some styling. So let's do our font size. We're going to go ahead and do 24 pixels. And then for our color, we're going to go ahead and do FF, 2F, and then 66. And so we'll get this nice looking like reddish pinkish color. And then because we extended our game object, we need to go ahead and add it to our scene. So we'll do this. We're going to go ahead and reference our scene. And then we're going to go ahead and add existing. And we'll go ahead and add in this game object. So let's go ahead and store a reference to our event bus component. We'll set that equal to our event bus. And let's go ahead and add this property to our class. And then what we'll also want to do is we're going to want a property to keep track of our score. So we'll go ahead and add one more property. We're going to call this score. And we're going to go ahead and set that equal to 0 in our constructor. So then for our score game object, what we'll do is let's go into our game scene. Let's go ahead and create an instance of it. So we'll come down to the bottom of our create method after our colliders. And let's do new. We'll do score. We'll pass in this, and we'll pass in our event bus component. So now what should happen is now we should see our 0 appear in our scene. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and update our origin, so then that way it's centered. So we'll go ahead and do this. We'll do set origin, and we'll do 0.5. Then that way our text game object is centered directly in our screen. All right, so now that we can see our text, now we need to go ahead and update it when one of our game objects is destroyed. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and use our event bus component. And so for our event bus component, we're going to use on, and now we need to reference our events, and we want the enemy destroyed event. And so we're going to go ahead and receive our enemy game object. And now for our enemy game object, we need to go ahead and grab the relevant score. So we go ahead and increment that. So what we'll go ahead and do is we'll reference our score property, and we're going to go ahead and increment it by the value of our enemy. And so for our enemy, what we need to do is associate the class name with our config. And so we're just going to go ahead and create a variable to do that. So we're going to do const, we're going to do enemy scores is going to be equal to this object. So we'll have our scout enemy. And so for that string, we want this to be equal to our config. Next, I should go ahead and import that in. So we'll do import star as config from .. and config.js. So now what we should be able to do with our IntelliSense, we'll have config, and we want our enemy, scout, and we want our score. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we want to go ahead and do the same thing for our fighter. And so we'll have our enemy, fighter, score, and now we want our fighter enemy. So now what we should be able to do is down back here where we're going to increment our score. Now we're going to go ahead and use our new enemy scores object. And for our property, we're just going to use that enemy. We're going to use the constructor. We're going to grab the name from that game object. And now that we've incremented our score, we need a way to go ahead and update our text game object. We want to update that text value. And so we're going to use this set text. And so this lets us update that string. And so we're going to go ahead and do this. We'll do our score. And because this is an integer, we're going to go ahead and do toString. So now it's a string. Oh, and real quick, we'll fix our import, and then we'll go ahead and save. So now if we want to go ahead and test our changes, let's go ahead and just try destroying one of our ships. We destroyed our fighter. We got 200 points. Oh, we got 100 points there, 200. Ah, yes. Okay, so when we saved, our formatting got messed up. We actually want this to be plus equals. So now we're incrementing. All right, so now we should go ahead and test our changes again. So let's go ahead and try destroying one of the ships. All right, we get 100. Now we're up to 300. All right, very nice. All right, so now that we have our scoring working, next we're going to go ahead and work on implementing our player lives feature into our game. And so for this, what we want to do is we want to have a UI component that's going to display how many lives our player actually has left. And then when our ship is destroyed, we want to go ahead and decrement that and then respawn our player. And then once we run out of lives, we're going to go ahead and have the game actually be in a game over state. And so we'll go ahead and display a message to the player. So for us to do this, we're going to go ahead and add some new events to our event mender. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and open up our event bus component. And we're going to want to know when our player spawns and when it's destroyed. And then so then that way we can go ahead and once our player actually spawns, we'll be able to re-enable input. So then that way our player can move around our scene. And we'll be able to use the player destroyed event to keep track of our lives and decrement them when this happens. And so to go ahead and do this, what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and add in player, and we'll do spawn event. We're going to add in player destroyed. And then finally, we're going to add one for game over, which will be emitted once we are destroyed and we have no lives left. So for our values, let's go ahead and use the same string. So now what we'll want to do is let's go ahead and open up our player object class. And then what we'll do is now when our ship is destroyed, we're going to go ahead and emit an event that our ship was destroyed. And so for us to go ahead and do that, we'll actually need to receive an instance of our event bus component. So what we'll do is let's come to our constructor. After we get our scene, we'll go ahead and add in our event bus component. So let's go ahead and add a property for this to our class. So after our collider component, we'll have our event bus component. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and assign that property to our event bus component. And now what we'll do is let's come down to our update method when our ship is destroyed. And so after we start playing our animation, let's go ahead and reference our event bus component. We'll go ahead and emit an event. And let's go ahead and import our custom events. And now we want to go ahead and do player destroyed. So now what we'll do is let's jump back to our game scene. We'll go ahead and update our player to have our instance of our event bus. So we'll have this, and then we'll have our event bus component. All right, so the next what we'll need to do is now we actually need to create our component for our lives. And so what we'll do is let's go into our objects. Let's go into our UI folder. We'll go ahead and add a new file and we'll call it lives.js. And so now for our lives, what we're going to do instead of using a text component, we're actually going to display player ships down our corner like old arcade machines. And so for each of our ships, we'll have a life. And so to do that, we'll go ahead and export our class. We're going to call it lives. And we're going to go ahead and extend our phaser game objects container game object. And so we'll do our game objects. Let's do container. And now we'll need some properties. We'll have a lives property to keep track of how many lives we have left. And then we'll need our event bus component so we can listen for that event that we just emitted. So let's go ahead and add in our constructor. And so for this, we'll need our phaser scene, and then we'll need our event bus component. So we'll go ahead and call super, and now we need to pass in our phaser scene. And now for our positioning, we're just going to go ahead and position in our bottom left-hand corner here. And so we're going to do 5 pixels, so we're a little bit over. And now we're going to go ahead and take our scene, our scale manager. We'll go ahead and grab our height. And then what we'll do is we're going to subtract 30, so then that way it's not right at the bottom, it's going to be a little bit up. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and pass an empty array, since we have no game objects to currently add to our container. Let's go ahead and update our event bus component to go ahead and have a reference to our event bus. And now we need to go ahead and set our lives. And so for our lives, what we want to go ahead and do is we're going to add a new property to our config. And so we'll do config, and we're going to call this player lives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to our score class. I'm going to copy our config real quick. I'm going to paste that in. And now let's go ahead and jump into our config. And at the top of our file, we're going to do export const. We'll have player lives, and we're going to go ahead and do 3 lives. So now if we jump back to our lives class, what we need to do is now we need to add our container to our scene. And so we're going to do this.scene, add existing, and we want to add this to our scene. So now that we've added our container, now we actually need to add our image game objects into our container. And so what we'll do is we're going to use a for loop. And so we'll do for let I equals 0 if I is less than our number of lives that we get from our config. Then we want to go ahead and increment this by 1. And so here we'll go ahead and create a new image. And so we'll do ship. We'll go ahead and do scene, add, do an image game object. And so for our image game object, for our position, we're going to use our index and our for loop to figure out how far over for our x we want to position our icons. And so for our first one, it'll be like here, then here, then here. And so to figure that out, we're going to use our I index. We're going to multiply it by 20. And then what we'll do is for our Y position, we're going to use 0. And now we need to use our ship game asset. So we'll be using the same asset as our player ship. And now we want to go ahead and scale it down a little bit so it's not so big. So we'll do set scale. Let's do 0.6. And then we'll do set origin. And so we'll do 0. So that way it's in the top left-hand corner. And now we need to go ahead and add that to our container. And so we'll do this, add, and we'll add our ship game object. Go ahead and save. Let's come over to our game scene, and we'll go ahead and create an instance of our new class. So after our score, we're going to do new, lives, this, and our event bus component. And as soon as we save, we should see now down in our corner, we have our 3 icons representing our player lives. All right, so next what we need to do is now we need to add our event listener for when our player is actually destroyed. And when it is destroyed, this is when we'll go ahead and update our lives. And then we'll go ahead and respawn our player ship. And so after our for loop, what we'll go ahead and do is let's reference our event bus component. We're going to use the on method. Let's grab our custom events. And now we want to go ahead and listen for our player destroyed event. So when this happens, in our callback, we're going to go ahead and update our lives. So we'll have this.lives. We're going to go ahead and decrement it by 1. And now we need to delete one of our image game objects. And so what we'll do is we're going to do this. We're going to do get at. Then we're going to go ahead and reference our lives, and then we're going to call the destroy method. And so what get does, it allows us to grab our game object from our container based on its index. And so when we add game objects to our container, Phaser keeps them in the order that we add them as their index. And so as an example, for our first ship here, it'll be at index 0, and then once we get to 1 for our next live, it'll be index 1, then 2, and then 3. And so by us using our lives as our index, what we're able to do is we can destroy the last game object here on our container. And so if we're going to test this real quick, we'll go ahead and have one of our enemy ships appear, and then we'll go ahead and have them collide with us, and we'll see our game object is now destroyed. All right, so what we'll want to do is if we have more than 0 lives, we'll want to go ahead and emit an event so we can respawn. And if we have no lives left, then we want to go ahead and display our game over text. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an if statement. We're going to do this. We're going to reference our lives. If it's greater than 0, then we want to go ahead and emit our event for respawning our player. But we don't want to do this right away. We want there to be a little bit of a delay, so then that way it takes like a second for our ship to respawn. And so to add that type of delay, we can use our time plugin. And on here we have a method called delayed call. And what this does, it allows us to provide a callback that'll be invoked after a set number of milliseconds. And so we're going to do 1,500, so 1.5 seconds. Then for our callback, this is we'll go ahead and emit our event. So we'll do our event bus component. We'll do emit, and we'll do our custom events, and let's do player spawn. So once we do that, we'll go ahead and return. And now what we need to do is if we don't have any lives left, let's go ahead and display a text game object that says, hey, the game is over. And so we'll do this. We'll do our scene, add, and we want to add a text game object. And so for our position, we want it right in the middle of our screen. So we're going to reference our scene, scale, our width, we'll divide by 2, and we'll do our scale. So we'll do this scene, scale, let's do our height, divided by 2. And for our text, we're just going to do game over. And for our styling, all we're going to do is set our font size. And we're going to set this to be 24 pixels. And then we're going to go ahead and update our origin, so then that way it's actually centered. And we'll do 0.5. And then what we want to do is now we want to go ahead and emit our event that our game's over because there's no lives left. And so we'll do event bus component, emit, and we'll do our custom events, and we're going to do game over. All right, so if we go ahead and save, what we want to go ahead and do is first, let's go ahead and test our game over text. So if we come over to our config, I'm going to go ahead and bump our lives down to 1. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save, and if we go to test real quick, let's go ahead and have our ship get destroyed. What should happen is we should run out of lives, and now we have our game over text appear. Nice. So I'm going to go ahead and revert that back to 3. And what we want to do now is we need to update our player class to listen for the spawn event. And when it happens, then we want to go ahead and have our game object reappear with all of our components reset to their initial state. So that way our health is back at the max. So to go ahead and do this, what we'll do is we'll come to our constructor and we're going to go ahead and listen for that event. So we'll do our event bus component. Let's do on. And so we'll go ahead and have our custom events. We'll do player spawn. And so when our player spawns, we'll go ahead and call a new private method. So we'll do this.spawn, and then we'll pass in our context of this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to come down to the bottom of our class. I'm going to go ahead and add that new method. So we're going to have spawn. And so when we spawn our game object, we want to do the opposite of our hide method here. And so I'm just going to copy these here. And so what we'll do is when we spawn, we're going to make us active. We'll make us visible. Then we want to go ahead and do the opposite of these as well. So we're going to paste those. So for our ship engine sprite, we're going to go ahead and set that equal to true. We'll make our thruster sprite visible as well. And then for locking our input, we're going to go ahead and unlock it. So we'll set it equal to false. Some other things we're going to want to do is because for our ship, we do our destroyed animation, we want to go ahead and reset our texture back to our first frame. And we want to reset our texture back to our ship. And so what we'll do is we'll do this. We're going to go ahead and do our ship sprite. We're going to do the set texture method. And so we're going to go ahead and set this back to ship. And we want to go ahead and do 0 for our frame. Now we want to go ahead and reset our health component. And so we'll do this, our health component, we're going to call reset. And then finally, we want to go ahead and update the position of our game object. So then that way spawn right back in the center of our screen. And so to do that, we're just going to do this. We're going to call set position. And now we want to go ahead and do the same position of where we spawn our player in our constructor. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to come up here. And I'm going to copy these pieces of code. We'll come back down here. we'll go ahead and paste those. And then we just need to update our references. So we'll have our container, this.scene, and then this.scene. So now to go ahead and make this consistent, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to hide our game object right off the bat. And so before we restore our event meta, we're just going to do this.hide. And what we're going to do is from our lives component, we're going to have this actually trigger spawning our player game object. And so to go ahead and do that, we're just going to go ahead and emit our spawn event. And then this is going to allow us to test it without being destroyed. So we'll see right away when our scene refreshes, our player ship is now back in our scene. And if we go ahead and get destroyed, we should be able to test our logic. So we'll go ahead and collide. We'll see our player gets destroyed, our live gets decremented, and now our ship is back in our scene. And even though we died over here, our ship is now back in the center of our screen. And finally, if we die one more time, we should see our game over text. Nice. All right, so one more change we're going to do is once we get to our game over screen, we're going to go ahead and stop spawning our enemy game objects, and then that way they just stop appearing in our game. And so to go ahead and do this, we're going to listen for our game over event in our spawn component, and when it's triggered, we're going to go ahead and disable our spawning. All right, so to go ahead and do this, let's go ahead and go into our enemy spawner component. And the first thing we're going to do is let's add a new property for this. And so we'll have a new private property. We're just going to call this disable spawning. In our constructor, we're going to go ahead and set this to be false by default. So we'll do disable spawning equals false. And now what we want to go ahead and do is now we want to listen for our event from our event bus. And so we're going to go ahead and do our event bus component. We're going to go ahead and do on. And now we need to listen for our custom events. And when our game over event is emitted, we're going to go ahead and set that property to be true. So we'll go ahead and copy that. Let's go ahead and paste it. And now what we'll do is down in our update method, we're just going to do a check to see if this is set to true, then we're not actually going to do anything. So down in update, so we'll do if this disable spawning is true, we'll go ahead and just return early. And so by doing this, we can easily enable and disable this. So then that way later on, we can allow a player to continue, and then we can just start respawning enemy game objects all over again. All right, so with that actually brings this video to an end. And so in our next video, we're going to work on adding audio to our game. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.